Childhood sexual abuse is an extremely rampant issue, but it's not talked about enough. Somehow it evokes feelings of shame, feelings of moral guilt. And as a society, this silence adds to the trauma of the survivors. And the violence creates pain not just for children while they are still young, but continues even in their adult life. And with no space to share, with no space to talk about the trauma, to talk about the pain, the healing gets further damaged. Questions arise like what kind of behavior even does qualify to be called childhood sexual abuse? If it is so rampant, what can we even do to protect our children? And if families themselves are spaces that are unsafe, how can anyone begin to imagine a society that is safe for each and every child? Welcome to Argumentative Indians. We have with us Miguel das Queah, founder of an organization called UTSAH that has been working for child rights in the Northeast. Welcome, sir, and thank you so much for joining us. I
Thank
would
you,
love to hear
Arzu,
from
for
you
inviting
about
me.
your experience for the issue so far.
Thank you, Arzu. So should I start right away?
Yeah,
Okay,
just to
okay.
introduce what exactly is the problem and how do we begin to even understand what kind of behavior can be called childhood sexual abuse? How do we begin to understand the issue?
Oh, well, it is pretty simple, actually. Not in the courts of law, but in our regular interactions in the community or in the society, in our families. See, it is linked to, of course, sexual intent. As simple as that. As human beings, I mean, there is sexual desires are inherent to human beings. Uh, but of course, what happens is when it is unleashed upon a child who does not understand the meaning of sex or sexuality, it might lead to a trauma.
Hmm.
So it is very simple. So child sexual abuse, basically any form of sexual interaction, be it penetrative, be it touch, or be it non-touch, interaction with the child. In India, the law says it's below the age of 18 years old. It is considered to be child sexual abuse. Uh, the problem is huge because of the trauma attached to it. Trauma as far as psychological trauma is concerned, and also in a lot of cases we see that physical trauma is also huge because the child's sexual organs are not ready for sexual kind of association, and thereby it causes a lot of physical trauma on the child as well. The Indian law, which is the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, it bans all forms of sexual interaction with any child who is below the age of 18.
Hmm.
Here, consent is immaterial. The law does not take into consideration consent because as a society, as a community, or as a government, we feel that children are not in the stage of their life where they can consent to something like a sexual activity. So it is basically meant to protect children from any form of psychological or physical violence that is attached with sexual activity. In India, the problem is, of course, big, not because the numbers say so. If you look at the National Crime Records Bureau data, in 2020, more than 28,000 cases of child sexual abuse were reported all across India.
Hmm.
But if you look at, if compare it with all the crime, the percentage is really small. Uh, uh, it is small because in child sexual abuse, like you said in your opening remarks, that it is at a lot of shame, taboo is attached to the subject, right? So a lot of children or their families do not report child sexual abuse. If you look at the NCRB data, you will find the majority of the crimes are against girl children. In fact, I have through years we have been seeing once the NCRB report comes out, there are these academic articles or news articles that are published and which say that that, okay, sexual crimes against children are mostly against girls. Well,
Hmm.
as far as the reported data is concerned, it's true. However, we have no idea of sexual violence on boys, on male children, or on transgenders, which is completely invisible anywhere as far as government data is concerned. Uh, well, the most vulnerable, again, drawing inference from the National Crime Records Data Bureau report, we see that the most vulnerable, or the highest amount of crimes happens with children between the age of 16 and 18. Of course, there are two sides of it. One, because 16 and 18 children are adolescents. They are in a stage where they're exploring sexual behavior. So it's very easy to groom children into having sex with an adult. Uh, However, the other side is that, unfortunately, what happens is we have a lot of issue on romantic relationships
Hmm.
between impliedly, I mean, consenting children. I mean, say 2 16-year-olds are having a romantic relationship. Unfortunately, the law looks at it also as sexual violence against, and the perpetrator is the boy, and the victim becomes the girl. Such is our legal framework, which, of course, we are, through conversations regionally and nationally, we are trying to change the narrative, because we feel that not all children who get into romantic relationships are out there to abuse children, right? So it's natural for a 16-year-old boy to fall in love with a 16-year-old girl, or a boy, or a transgender, right? So these are lacunae in the law, but nonetheless, the problem is huge. Why probably we have a very strong law like the Protection of Children from Sexual Offences Act, which is very commonly known as the POXO Act, is because we don't have a very strong system. And the cases of genuine violence against children are also huge and non-reported. So it was felt that it was time to have a law that will actually put an umbrella kind of protection to all children from even falling into a crack. Or, if they do fall into a crack, there has to be proper rehabilitation. So this was the introduction to the subject, or to the theme of child sexual abuse. Well, it is interesting that when I was looking at your poster today, the question is, and even behind you, the virtual screen behind you, it says, "Are India's children safe?" So I would always say that it is always a warp and waft of yes and no's. No, because if you look at safety just from the perspective of, you cannot look at safety just from the perspective of sexual violence. I mean, we have problems like homelessness, land rights issues, domestic violence, and these are contexts that make children vulnerable, extremely vulnerable, in fact. Yes, because everyone is not a sex offender, so children don't have much to worry about. Again, yes, again, because we have a very robust child protection system set by the law. No, again, because the child protection system is not very strong, and it is not ably, being able to provide response services to children who have been victims of sexual violence. So it's always a mixed bag of yes and no's when you talk about how safe India's children are today.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for explaining the issue. And while you were talking about it, and the idea of consent came up, and that how, for children under the age of 18, consent is not even considered, because they aren't able to understand their own sexuality. They aren't able to understand their own sexual autonomy at that age. And we have the POXO Act, we have a lot of legal systems in place, but in order to access those legal systems, first the issue needs to get out of that own private and personal shame. Because if a child who's undergone that sexual trauma is unable to even understand what it is unable to even understand what happened, is unable to understand that, oh, this was something bad that shouldn't have happened, the child would not be able to report it. So how is it that families usually report these issues, and how is it that the children find that space within the domestic sphere? Because I was also reading up and I found that most of the offenders or abusers are people that the families trust. They are people within the personal circles of the child. So how does the issue or how does the incident even get to the authorities in the first place?
Well, see, first of all, in our country, and I mean, in all societies, in South Asian societies, we have these, imaginary, kind of moral boundaries to everything. And some, of course, are very harmful. Some, of course, are necessary. But something like, before talking about sexual violence, India is the most popular, one of the most populated country, and we still kind of shy away from talking about sex. It's quite an irony. Even in adult groups, when adult friends talk about sex, it's always kind of in a very hush hush way, in sometimes with which are linked to sexist jokes, lewd jokes. That is the conversation that we kind of basically, our conversations are limited to that when we talk about sex. Even with your parents, I mean, probably we are grown-ups, but to talk about sex even now with our parents is a big deal. The parents will shy away, they will not talk about it, they will say, oh my god, how can you say such dirty things? So there's a kind of a perverse characteristic attached to the subject of sex in itself. Probably it's linked to the larger patriarchal ecosystem that we live in, or the gender divide that is prevalent. So there, of course, the reasons are many, but it is important now to break away from that, and have these conversations driven by the state itself. Now, I remember when I was in school, a subject like biology, they had removed the sex part of it, the sexual organ part of it. I don't know why, but that happened and still happens to a certain extent. But it is very important for us to break away from it. In fact, what happens, I was very happy when the POXO Act was introduced. The POXO Act talks about, and even when I do trainings with the police and the judicial officers, they're always so shy, because the sexual POXO Act is rife with terms like vagina, urethra, anus, penis, which we never spoke about openly. I think that for us is a big starting point to having conversations about, about sex, about our body parts, and which will make it easier for the community or the society at large to accept, these terminologies, to accept that a subject like sex, sexual organs can be talked about. Mm. So yeah, state-driven conversations. Secondly, in colleges, universities, schools. But again, it has to be part of policy for schools to try and implement that. Suddenly, if I go and talk about sex in a private school, I mean, they'll be shocked. It has to begin slow, but nonetheless, there has to be enough communication on the subject, through school curriculums, through TV shows, through age appropriate programs, because suddenly you cannot talk to a 5-year-old about sex. It is not even practical. But there would be age appropriate communication techniques through which you can at least start to talk about the child, about his or her body parts, and or how to keep those body parts private and safe from others. So yes, so these things need to be talked about. And finally, when there is massive communication all around about it, then we will see that in families, amongst family members, these conversations happen. But it is, again, a long process, because like I said, I mean, let's first talk about sex, for example. Let's get comfortable with that. Now it is limited to the good touch and the bad touch, which the terminologies have changed. Now we say safe or unsafe, or appropriate or inappropriate. Not only touch, gesture, sound, anything. So those things children should learn from a very young age. And of course, age appropriately, they learn about their body parts. Like, for example, you can call your some part a name of a flower, or anything that the child identifies with, and how that part the child has is private to the child. and no one else can touch it, and surely not in a way that makes the child feel so uncomfortable. But again, it has to go step by step. At least if we start conversations somewhere, and that will have a multiplying effect. So it is very important, schools, colleges, amongst friend circles, in cafe conversations, on social media, and these conversations need to begin. And
Hmm.
that is where, maybe in 20 years time, we'll have a context where we don't shy away from talking about sex or sexual violence. And then it'll give people more power to go and, or more agency to go and report.
Right, right. So what I'm understanding is that the adults need to start talking about sex first, because
Absolutely.
the children are dependent upon that ecosystem. The children are dependent upon the caregivers, not just the parents, but say the teachers, the neighbors, the extended relatives. Again, but that brings me back to the same question, that how the very same community that is out there to protect the child is also the community that could potentially be the biggest perpetrator, according to what is read. I mean, you of course would know a little more on your from your field work. So again, is there anything that the caregivers can do to perhaps identify if sexual abuse is taking place, or anything that the other stakeholders that are more personal in the child's life? Because for a child to access POXO, or for the child to access that policy-driven conversation, that still is a huge deal. It would take a lot of time, and then accessibility also becomes an issue, because the language that the state would talk in, or the language that other formal structures would talk in, would not be accessible to the child. So, for the accessibility and to make sure that the private circle of the child is safer, what do you think the caregivers can do about it?
See, caregivers, I think maybe we have seen many cases where the caregiver becomes the perpetrator. If you're
Yeah,
talking about inner circle,
yeah.
it is the caregiver. So I always stress on state-driven initiatives. See, an NGO like us, we have our
Hmm.
constraints, right?
Hmm.
So a state has a much larger access to communities through very different decentralized, bodies,
Hmm.
starting from the Gaon Panchayat, the subdivision to the district level. So there are various kind of mechanisms in place.
Hmm.
Uh, while, for example, we say something like a polio intervention, when it is state driven, it has a larger access,
Right.
right? Like a COVID vaccination, when it is state driven, it has a larger access. I mean, NGOs and civil society and UN bodies can play a part in it, of course, assist the state at the community level, but the initiative has to be driven by the state.
Hmm.
It also ensures sustainability as well. So, so these like you say, caregivers. Like I have, for example, still do work in cases where the father is the perpetrator.
Hmm.
So in that, any conversation, what caregivers can do probably end up in you trying to teach a sex offender how not to rape their own children. So so it has to be like a norm, like an accepted norm everywhere, that people need to understand that how does uh, child sexual abuse affect the child, and what are the outcomes of child sexual abuse. Generally, people don't talk about it.
Hmm.
We do stress. I mean, in intelligent or educated circles, we have, oh my God, the psychological violence. But how many times do we actually? How many times do we even talk about it?
Hmm.
It's just a conversation at a coffee shop or a nice social do we go to. That's why I said that these conversations need to be everywhere. It has to have visibility in social media, in, like I said, in TV programs. In, for example, children are hooked onto video games and cartoons,
Hmm.
right? So why not incorporate that safety into those aspects as well? So it has to be overwhelming, while we also have to be careful that the children should not think that everyone is a sex offender.
Yeah.
That is the flip side of it. I
Yeah.
mean, going and I mean, since we have worked, we are activists, and we kind of fall into that trap. We see everyone as a potential offender, which is wrong. Uh, so communication in a way, and it should be all pervasive. It should be everywhere, and so that it that also motivates, healthier and easier dialogues. You can openly
Mhm.
talk about it, and that if that happens, it will come into the family space itself. For now, coming back to the core of your question, that if parents who are concerned about the protection of their children, one, they should be aware of the offense themselves. Secondly, they should be able to educate or communicate protection mechanisms or protection kind of techniques to their own children,
Hmm.
of how, what to be aware of, who to stay far away from, what are the safe and unsafe touches, words, gestures, or any kind of messages that come to social media, and that how they should report it to their parents. Also, parents should have a monitoring mechanism of what their children are accessing online, because a lot of CSM or a lot of kind of bullying or sexually explicit messages come through Facebook, through
Hmm.
WhatsApp. So parents must be aware of that as well. Like I said, I mean, it is not very simple to have one answer,
Yeah.
but at every step, one, the adults need to make themselves aware.
Hmm.
Secondly, when they are aware, they should communicate the same to their children and to their community members. Uh, and thirdly, the state-driven policies, which reaches to the family unit, which
Hmm.
reaches to the community, which reaches to the gram panchayats, to the subdivisional office level,
Hmm.
or to the district magistrate level. At all levels, there should be a concerted effort to talk about or to disseminate information on protection from child sexual abuse.
Right, right. It's interesting how, it also somehow makes me feel slightly helpless on the issue, considering that when you think about, anyone in your personal circle could be a potential sex offender. So what you're saying is that it needs to be state driven. It can't completely be driven from the family members. And uh, what worries me then is that the state has its own biases, right? Even if it's not written down, but the state has its own biases, for example, for queer children. For example, in the cases of consensual sex, when you said that even if you're a 16-year-old being in a relationship with another person, the boy could potentially be punished for just being in a relationship with another 16-year-old. So the state has its own biases that trickle down in these cases, and already children form a vulnerable part of our society. They don't vote, so anyway, it's not like they really come up and they are taken care of in that way, and it's not often talked about. So how do we ensure that these biases don't trickle down into the families as well? Because that is what happens, be it in case of queer children, be it in case of boy children, because also it's the general public understanding, right, that boys are sort of way superior or way more power holding in the family dynamics, in the family structure. So how do we understand that then?
Okay, about state biases. I mean, state will always have biases. I mean, this is, I think the state sometimes we have this. The state has a tendency to oppress. So, but having that's where NGOs and civil society leaders come into play. Youth leaders come into play. Universities, which are, of course, there are certain, clamp down on the entire, and which governments do quite unabashedly, but nonetheless there has to be messages coming from these strong civil society groups, especially civil society groups that care, and that's what's holding the system. I mean, there will be fallbacks, like we fought so much to stop death penalty, for example, because it does not solve the issue, but nonetheless the death penalty was included into the POXO Act, right? So it's like still now civil society groups like my friends and I from across the country are still trying to address the issue of of romantic relationships where another child is criminalized, right? So, and also children who come in conflict with law, especially children who are actually committing sexual offenses, especially after the Jyoti Singh Pandey gang rape in Delhi. Entire public mood was to basically criminalize and get the minor sex offender hanged. But that makes things more difficult. That's how civil society groups should come together, and that's where they guide and mold the way statal policies should be for children. And Of course there will be failures. I mean, of course they, I mean, look at history. I mean, not what all civil, I mean, people who are from the civil society, what they feel are not reflected in policies all the time. But nonetheless, the fact that you actually have a law, nonetheless that you have a system, is actually driven by the civil society. Biases are like, you know, those embellishments which the state puts, but if you look at the flesh of it, the main part of it, where did the idea of these children's homes come, open shelters come, or where did the idea of an entire, you know, separate system for children who come in conflict with law, the juvenile justice system, come from? Globally, it has been driven by experts and civil society actors. And then the state basically plays a part of kind of enacting them as laws or as international laws. But most of it is driven by civil society nonetheless. So we should not give up. No, that is where the civil society, the youth groups, the student unions, the sangatans that are there in Assam. I mean, we have so many sangatans in Assam, the Assam, the students union, other indigenous groups. So people who feel, so they should try to keep their narrative alive, and which can kind of eliminate the biases one by one. But you cannot say it will be like a 100% outcome, but most of it would be what the civil society wants, because laws are a reflection of what we want. And apart from, you know, factions, certain parts of the law that are that reflect the biases of the state. So nonetheless, I think, yes, it is important for the civil society to be very active in that space. I began my work because of this, because there was no conversation on child sexual abuse in Assam. No one was having these interactions with the state. No one was providing support to children who are victims of child sexual abuse. No one was talking to the judiciary. The only method of communication was through having conferences and seminars, which were so officious that there were hardly any outcomes to it. But one needs to effect that kind of easygoing communication with all actors to basically point you or put your point across. So it has to be everywhere, and civil society actors need to play a very important. Unfortunately, what happens is civil society is so fractured itself. It is not being able to come together. But for issues like child sexual abuse, which is a non-negotiable, I think on these aspects, the civil society must come together.
And it also makes me wonder when you talk about the civil society that often the image that comes to my mind is very like urban upper class or middle class, or a certain demographic that has access to these civil societies, because when I imagine child sexual abuse, even in my own circles, when I initiate these conversations with friends and especially with women, because that's easier to have vulnerable conversations in certain spheres, and it's so hard to even begin to access children who are not in that demographic. Children who are out there in the streets, children who are perhaps being raised inside brothels, children who are, being raised inside landfills, and even, for example, children of migrant laborers who don't have one place to stay. And in such cases, it's extremely difficult for the children to even begin to access that vocabulary, to begin to access those sense of structures that could potentially protect them from child sexual abuse, or perhaps, I don't know, but I'm also wondering, is it even normalized to a certain extent in certain demographics where the idea of it being a crime isn't even that stark in that strata.
See, what happens is, so one is that I think civil society exists at all levels.
Hmm.
I don't know about rest of the country, but in Assam, we saw, migrant communities have their groups. Of course, because most of it is linked to politics, which is important because you need to have political representation because you constitute the subaltern, right? But you need to be heard. So
Hmm.
you organize yourself politically first. But there can be other issues that those organizations can take. Recently, I was in Upper Assam and I was having these conversations with some of the local organizations, grassroots organizations, where the only thing that they talk about price rise, they talk about several other issues of local or national importance. But what my conversation was that in that narrative, they should also incorporate child sexual abuse as an issue or child protection as an issue. And in fact, it was an idea that no one gave them. So now, I think next month they all are coming into Guwahati and trying to they've asked us to help, basically, help them formulate a program through which they can actually, and they have huge outreach. When you talk about politics, this is very, the outreach is huge. And I said, instead of talking about things that are not very relevant, sometimes you switch to topics that are relevant to you. For
Hmm.
example, the child labor problem, or the problem of child marriage, or something as grave as child sexual abuse. So these are issues that civil society can address. So when I talk about civil society, grassroots organizations are incorporated into that.
Hmm.
So us as someone who people who feel for the issue can obviously work alongside with civil society organizations at the grassroots so that, again, to just have the conversation. We have to keep it simple. Coming back to the second part of your question, have we, normalized it? What have we not normalized? What form of violence have we not normalized? A husband will beat up the wife, and the wife would still want to protect the husband, because the context is such. It's so regressively patriarchy driven that women will come. I have cases like that, but women come, so he has hit me and he has done. I want to see him in jail, and the very next day she'll come crying, saying that no,
Hmm.
it was a mistake on his part. So that is one. Say someone's brother will almost kill his or his girlfriend, and the family will still want to protect that boy. You look at everywhere, you look at and then your uncle will rape someone. You will say, no, my uncle can never do that. And no one listens to the child. So we have normalized violence at everything, in every aspect of our life. Look at something like marital rape. The laws are reflective of what we are largely.
Hmm.
So, marital rape, we don't think, and I would not say the government does not think, I would say we don't think that marital rape is an issue. So again, that's a form of violence that has been normalized completely, and it happens. So here, what happens? Social relations or family relations are more important to us than something like child sexual abuse. It
Hmm.
is just seen at best as a minor aberration,
Hmm.
and what happens, so we have this very casual attitude towards violence. And we reinforce it as well. Look at families who are saying, "Oh, I am against sexual violence. I am against domestic violence," there, but their kids are playing video games that are shooting and killing people,
Hmm.
not realizing that you are actually reinforcing a kind of violence, and how the child internalizes that is only. The experience is only of the child, which will come out later in life.
Hmm.
And we find. Look at inside our homes, domestic violence. It's so normal. I know activists whose families are rife with domestic violence, and they would come up and talk about violence, and including myself. I would never like to address the topic publicly. or say it publicly, because it'll, oh my God, what happened? Oh, you are a child sexual abuse activist, and then in your own family there's violence. So things like that often restrict us from talking about violence, and sometimes we just shirk it away. We say it's okay. I mean, let it go. So letting go of domestic violence is as bad as letting go of child sexual abuse. I mean, both are forms of violence. I mean, we don't now hear people justify by saying degrees of violence. No, any form of violence is wrong. Unless for self-defense. Of course, if a girl is walking down the street and someone tries to grope that girl, then she would give one tight slap. That's you protecting yourself from an offender.
Right.
But that's not you perpetrating violence, right? And we find a way to justify. Look at the memes and the trolls. I mean, what are they but violence? They're all forms of violence. And we say, oh, it's okay. It's perfectly all right. And we should understand that child sexual abuse or sexual violence is a subset of the larger, spectrum of violence. And if we reduce overall violence, you will always you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah. So that is, it's linked. Because everything is in violence. It's about power, it's about patriarchy, it's about gender, it's about class. You do away with that, you will see that there is an automatic reduction of child sexual abuse. It's interlinked. We cannot talk about one by leaving out the other. So yeah,
that's extremely interesting, and makes me realize how even subliminal small acts of violence that are all around us contribute directly or indirectly to the issue at hand. Um, but I'm also pretty curious about when you mentioned that something as simple as basic is violence in video games, or parents monitoring what a child is consuming on the internet, messaging on Facebook, or perhaps access to pornography and all these things. And it makes me wonder if all of this also, to some extent, perhaps threatens the privacy of the child. Or is there something as privacy of the child? Can we even begin to imagine something like privacy that the child can access to, considering that the situation is so bad? Do the parents really need to perhaps intervene in every activity that the child is engaging in, out of this fear that perhaps potentially something wrong could happen? And if the child is given access to that privacy, considering in cases of adolescence and even otherwise, the understanding level might not be that much. So how do we balance that? How do we understand the
see,
privacy?
again, that is a policy. Again, that's a policy level issue. Of I feel that everything that technology, for example, let's just talk about technology here. Everything that the child has access to on the internet, it has to be age appropriate. That is age appropriate and viewership appropriate, because it's simple like a video game where they're killing and massacring people, to the child having access to pornography. And I wouldn't have moral boundaries around pornography, but the mere fact that the pornographic material that the child is accessing is actually dehumanizing the woman there. So and it's just as in the if you see most of it, it is the woman is objectified. So it is again a policy matter where access to age appropriate material. Children should have access to information, but it should be age appropriate, because we are also guided by the best interest principle of the Juvenile Justice Act. Whatever we do should be in the best interest of the child, and should not, of course, like I said, will take into account uh, issues that the child can negatively affect children, not in the perception of an individual, but in general. I mean, sometimes parents say, okay, in the best interest of the child, I gave the child a spanking. I mean, that is
Yeah.
not best interest of the child, because you are violating the child's right to protection there,
But
right?
in so many cultures, then parenting is also so different. For example, if you go to rural India, or when I talk to especially my brothers or my cousins, sort of spanking and giving a slap and threatening and fear becomes almost a mode of parenting, and it's so culturally appreciated almost. It's reinforced.
So I call these traditional harmful practices. People don't like traditional harmful practices because it's so ingrained in the culture that you think it's okay. I mean,
Hmm.
so was sati, you know, so was child marriage. I mean, these are all very, I mean, probably your grandmother got married when she was 12-year-old.
Hmm.
We have those stories, right? But is it okay today?
Hmm.
It is not. So we just need to know the better way, and we are waiting for that, to come. And that's why what we do in all our conversations with parents, it's such a difficult topic to talk about. Oh no, I mean, now my friends who have children, their parents hardly get their children to me, because they say, okay, now you'll complain to Miguel uncle, and Miguel uncle will come and give it to us. So in my dinners, I hardly see children, because they say that, no, 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 we are not getting our children to you, because then they'll come and tell you that I have done something, and then you will come, like, behind us, and you'll give us a long lecture. But that is how, I think that things will change.
Hmm.
Now, a lot of private schools, there is no spanking in private schools, which was unheard of few years back. Apart from some of the missionary schools, in private schools, there's a complete zero tolerance. I
Hmm.
mean, I know, I can speak for Guwahati city. I mean, the majority of the private schools. I went to a school where there was no spanking.
Hmm.
So, and this is my age, I'm talking about my age, because I went to a boarding school and there was no spanking. Of course, there were cases of bullying, that's different. This is child on child kind of thing. But
Hmm.
from teachers, there was a zero tolerance policy against corporal punishment, against any form of violence against a child. So,
Hmm.
anyway, coming back to what you asked, is that I think I strayed away from that topic. But yeah, but just because we don't know the better way, does
Hmm.
not mean that what we are doing is right.
Hmm.
There is a better way. There is a way to kind of secure the best interest of the child. We were talking about internet privacy, talking about a right to privacy. So, yes, the child has a right to privacy uh, to an extent where it does not cause harm to the child. Because, like we say, children are vulnerable.
Hmm.
Like say a tuition teacher who is taking tuition
Hmm.
in a room. Either we educate our children on the larger kind of, good, safe, unsafe touch kind of, or gesture behavior,
Hmm.
uh, kind of things, or we have to sometimes go in the room. And sometimes, the child might say, oh, why are you coming in all the time? But no, because it's for the child's safety. So these things, or in schools, for example, but teachers cannot go in everywhere to see what is happening. But there has to be a child protection policy in place, and teachers should be from time to time trained
Hmm.
on how, what are the non-negotiables as far as child protection is concerned.
And even for parents to start doing that, or for teachers to start doing that, it requires a certain baseline of sensitivity already towards the issue, a certain grounding of awareness, of a certain acceptability that yes, this can happen and it does happen, and how to then we protect the child. But in most cases, in my conversations with my parents, or with even my friends, I've realized that the idea is mostly to snub the issue down and to not let it out in the public, because it would bring shame to the family, because it would dishonor the family. And often, in conversations or even through personal experience, I've realized even if the child wants some sense of justice, the parents snub it down because the cost, or the social cost, would be too high. The shame would be too high. So, what can the child do in such circumstances where, again, the caregivers don't allow for such instances to be reported?
See, it will be the same of what the wife can do when she's beaten up by the husband. It can be the same of what the wife can do when she's being a victim of marital rape. So once we have those answers, we'll surely have the answers to what a child can do when the child becomes a victim of sexual violence. But having said so, we have an elaborate arrangement. I mean, now we have helpline numbers, the 1098,
Yeah.
which is the child line services, which needs to reach to every town and city and district. It has not, but it should, so that the child can at least have an access to some a system where they can get their protection issues addressed. The Juvenile Justice Act has again an extensive arrangement of institutions like child welfare committees, district child protection offices. They're all there. The National Commission for the Protection of Child Rights has a POXO e-box through which you can report. The Thanedar, I mean, the child welfare police officer in the nearby Thana should be so sensitive so as to respond progressively to a case of child sexual abuse and help the child get such protection. Civil society organizations all around, gram panchayats, like I said, asha workers, anganwadi karmis. So what happens if all are trained and sensitized on the issue? If a child in the community has a problem, the child should know that there is an alternative. There is a mechanism that protects me. Unfortunately, the mechanism is not that strong as on date. However, through all our initiatives, all that we do, not only us, but every organization, every individual, or say someone like you who is taking this initiative of having this conversation, is uh, bringing changes, maybe because one of your conversations, I mean, there'll be change somewhere. And it is again a very collective approach. And that's how we, like, for example, I'm a field worker, I work on field. When you have these conversations, you're basically collaborating with me on the same issue. And this concerted joint effort will bring about a change, not maybe tomorrow, but if you continue this for the next 5 years, you'll see that our systems, our response mechanisms are more strengthened. Young people will be more empowered or will have the agency to come forward and report, including cases of violence in their own homes. But for that, we need to have a very robust child protection system. And all that we do, is towards having that ideal system in place so that children don't feel isolated or unprotected at any point in time.
Yeah, and to have that sense of state mechanism, to have that sense of structure that is so sensitive and so accessible to the child. And I'm also wondering that if a system like that would be desirable to have it intervene in family systems, in the sense that a lot of parents or a lot of adults in the family might feel like their way of parenting or their way of raising a child or their personal family matters are being politicized. So to what extent can the state even intervene, is something that I was wondering.
See, when there is violence, then there has to be intervention. There is no other way. Like we already had the conversation around normalizing and violence at all levels and everything that we do. But how long will we normalize this? If your neighbor, if there is a wife battering in your neighborhood house, it is your responsibility to report to the state. And by state, I meant the police, for example. You have to respond. You have to, I mean, there should be zero tolerance towards violence against humans. I mean, forget about humans. Now we're talking about zero tolerance to violence against wildlife. We're talking about zero tolerance to violence against environment. I mean, we have stopped cutting down trees. I mean, cutting down trees is a form of violence. So what happens is, so at every level, if there is violence, I mean, no one's intervening. I mean, if a child is being raised in a protected environment, no one is intervening. But if it is violence, and that's precisely why the state has the right, the children who have no one to take care of, they call the state's children, because the state has to give you that. now under the law. So it is not a question about your family privacy versus, the child's right to protection. It's not an adversarial position. It should go hand in hand. I mean, your family privacy is intact till you take good care of the child. But if you cannot take good care of the child, the state will have to take care of the child.
So do you think the state should scrutinize child rearing?
Child?
Child rearing or parenting? Do you think that the
Huh.
state should scrutinize or examine child rearing? Because
Examine as in?
that's what I'm wondering. Because as of now, we're talking about a situation where if a child wants to reach out to the state is ready and accessible and sensitive. But I'm also wondering, in cases where the child is unable to reach out, to what level can the state intervene within the family? And is it even desirable to do that?
Yes, I mean, see, if that's what I said. Again, the first part of the whole conversation, when there is dialogue everywhere, I mean, talk about an Indian actor, everyone in the villages. I mean, people in villages here know about Michael Jackson because, I mean, the media talked about Michael Jackson so much that everyone knows about him, right? So once we talk about the mechanisms that are in place, where to reach, who to reach to, and if that is common knowledge, we are aiming for that common knowledge. When it is common knowledge that this is sexual abuse, these are the mechanisms, this is how I can get help, or from where I can get help, or and on the other hand, like what we do, when the system is sensitive, is trained, well trained to respond to those concerns on both ways, then you see that, one, it will be a deterrent because parents will know that if you're basically spanking your child, then the state will put a sanction on you.
Right.
Or the possibility is that the state will take the children to a more protected space. And secondly, the child knows that, if the child is, it reminds me of a joke by Russell Peter, where somebody's gonna get a hurt real bad. Where when in the US, when the parents spanks the child, they can call up the child's helpline service. So what the parent did when they came for the holiday at the airport, he got down and started hitting the child, because here he cannot, or he or she cannot call up the child helpline, right? So, but again, we need to reach to that where the child always has an alternate protective context, if that context cannot be provided at home. Family, of course, is the ideal. So what do we do? So we do trainings for parents of alternative methods of child management. We don't call it discipline. I mean, even parents are most indisciplined sometimes. So, how to manage your children sans violence, So, and it is a possibility, because we cannot say that schools that are not applying or administering corporal punishment, good children are not coming out of those schools. They are. I mean, there is still brilliance and merit coming out of those schools, and children doing quite well. But on the other hand, yes, children who went, like people like us. I mean, I, of course, was never a victim of physical violence. Psychological, yes. But you see children who have, it stays somewhere in your life. It'll come in, and we don't even realize, because like we said, we live in a context which is so content with violence that tomorrow, if you're, say, screaming down on someone and using abusive words and being temperamental, you say, I'm just temperamental, But why am I temperamental? To an extent that, I had to unleash abuse on another person. It is linked to my experience in my childhood, which can only be addressed because when you go to counseling sessions, then you know what the connect is. Otherwise, we don't address those problems at all. And we have normalized all of it. And mostly because we have normalized all of it. So coming back, yes, advisable to an extent where the child has a protection issue. Not advisable if, I mean, again, the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child say that state cannot arbitrarily interfere. There has to be a reasonable explanation for that interference. And if that reasonable explanation is related to or linked with violence on that child or protecting the child from violence, then the state has to respond. There is no other way. It's like saying when children are going into trafficking and are being, say, in uh, say an exploitative situation by consent. I, for one, will respond because a 15-year-old child, I mean, is groomed to give consent and live in an exploitative cycle of abuse and exploitation where more than 12 men are having sex with that child every day. So what do? The child says, I have given consent to this. I get money from this. But I need to interfere. I need to intervene. And that might sometimes be construed as infringing upon the privacy and the rights of the child to livelihood. But isn't that harmful for children? Again, but it should not be linked. The flip side is people link it with morality all the time. It is not about morality. The conversation is not about, okay, there's a moral issue with the child. No, there's a protection issue with the child. So absolutely, the state needs to intervene.
Thank you for sharing that. And, when you were talking about healing in such cases, where you were talking about how in our acts as adults, a lot of it shows up. A lot of what we went through in our childhood, it keeps coming back to us later in life. And counseling, again, is something that's not very accessible for everyone. It's not something that's very accessible, especially, say, in the rural setting or in the lower strata where people from a certain class can't afford counseling. In your experience, how do you think children heal from such incidences? How is it that they cope with it, and how does healing then take place?
Oh, well, it depends on the form of violence, the status of the offender. Children are different. Every child has different coping mechanisms. Sometimes when the child is very well, kind of taught, then they have stronger, coping mechanisms. Resilience is much better. So every child we have seen in sexual abuse cases, every child responds differently. For some, it's the trauma is huge. Some it's linked to their physical trauma that leads to psychological trauma. For some, the trauma is psychological but leads to psychosomatic disorders. So what happens is different from the narrative is different from every child. For example, romantic relationships. The child says, not trauma. I was not traumatized. I was in love with him. So everything changes. So just kind of telling that, okay, in a relationship, there's a trauma. No, there might not be trauma. Sometimes we also try to impose, oh, no, you have gone through trauma. Because the child probably loves that person or that young child, another child, and might not experience the trauma that, say, someone else might have gone through. It generally happens when a person of trust does that, because there's a huge breach of trust.
Yeah.
Secondly, it happens when children don't realize what's happening to them. Suddenly they feel different, and that leads to massive psychological anxiety and stress, and finally resulting in depression. For some, it is violent, like physically violent. For some, it leads to pregnancy. So these again end up in psychological trauma. So where there is trauma, of course, counseling is the best way of addressing it. It is one of the best ways. However, how many children would have access to counseling? Even if they do, in children's home, I was discussing with you other day itself, that in children's homes, a counselor is paid 8,000 rupees. In the state government children's home, 8 or 9,000. Now, which good quality counselor would come and do that job? No one, right? So you have to make do with mediocre counselors. Secondly, our university is spawning out enough counselors in the first place. Assam, for one, I mean, there are no outstanding counseling degrees in colleges. So that is one big problem. If still children manage to have access to counseling, it can, to a certain extent, expedite the process of healing. But again, if you come back to court procedures, if you have to repeatedly go to police station, it keeps on coming back again and again. So counseling is important for healing, not to forget, but to heal. Secondly, I have seen that there are certain natural ways of healing. Probably say we all have experienced traumatic events in our childhood. I, for example, when I saw domestic violence, so but how do I heal? Probably I know of one of the cases where a little child who had been sexually assaulted by her uncle did not want to go into children's home, but stay in the same home. Of course, the uncle had been arrested and he was put into the judicial custody. But because the child had formed a new friendship with the boy child next door. Now she found it completely healing. In fact, after 3 years, we saw that her healing was extraordinary. And she's happy. She is doing well academically. So that friendship also healed her. In another case, for example, a child who refused to speak to our counselor for almost 2.5 hours. She tried. She just refused to speak. And then the counselor told me that, no, Miguel, you have to help me here. Now, I am not a counselor, but I have worked with children. So I just asked her the first question, who's your favorite singer? And back she answered, she knew Zubin Garg is my favorite singer, who's a very famous Assamese singer. And everyone was shocked. And she started smiling. I was like, then I told her, do you know that I know Zubin Garg personally? She said, oh my God, you know Zubin Garg? How? I said, I can make you meet him. So in the next few days, we actually now she goes to shows with him, to see shows along with him. And she's doing well academically. She's working in a non-profit organization that makes, these weaves, which are exported. So that was her healing journey. So we find natural ways of healing, sometimes confiding in a friend, sometimes getting involved in something that basically amplifies healing. For example, some children, I know of one child who got into pottery, for example, and found it extremely healing. Boy children who found healing in being a part of sports, and this girl child who recently has gone through tremendous trauma. Now she wants to play football. And she said that a football will make me happy. And no sooner did we give her to football, her entire thing changed. So there are natural ways, and we need to identify. We have not identified enough, because our immediate thing is, okay, you are a child sexual abuse victim, okay, go for counseling. But what if you can't reach us, and how do you heal nonetheless? I mean, in a deep remote area, for example, in a hill area in Assam, you might not find a counselor for your life.
Yeah.
But that does not mean you cannot heal. Maybe a walk through the forest can heal you. I mean, this is just an idea, but I'm sure there are natural ways of healing. And it's only time. We'll need some more research and some more studies probably into it. And that would be the best, because no one wants to go into an institutional setup for healing. Actually, no child should go to an institutional setup. It should just happen to you naturally. And we hope in the next few years, we are able to find at least some. We are experimenting now. Maybe in 5 years down the line, we'll be able to come up with more kind of conclusive data on how activities without counseling can also lead to healing. But again, families need to be very supportive. That is extremely important, because I have seen Indian families have the habit of taunting. Even if you have, say, in romantic relationships, we have seen where the girl child, loves someone, but that guy cheats her, and then he uses her, exploits her, and then leaves her. And then the child comes home. Yes, there is reporting, there is case. But if there is, say, an argument within a parent and a child, the parent will suddenly say that, okay, I know your character, how it was 2 years back. You are the one who. So again, that kind of, increases the wound. It festers. So parents need to be extremely sensitive, because Indian parents have this, I have seen in all cases, this habit of taunting, you know, taunting, belittling, condescending remarks. You have to be extremely sensitive in the way that you are interacting with a child who has gone through psychological trauma. Forget about sexual violence. Children go through psychological trauma otherwise as well. We for different reasons, and parents do not understand that. They feel that is sadness, and
Hmm.
no sadness with a taunt. It will be okay. You will be happy. Oh, we had so many of these, and what's wrong with you? So sensitivity in parenting should come in. And because parents, again, and I'm like a hardcore child rights activist. So I believe, because I believe children are not your properties of adults. They have their own set of rights, and the parents have to be extra sensitive while child rearing, that they, at every step they are protecting the rights of their children. Because like Khalil Gibran's famous poem, children are, they are not yours. They come through you, you know but you don't own them. So this is the primary. Parenting needs to be very sensitive. Parents are always, because they are the powers that are no higher at the power structure. Everyone, including parents, feel they're entitled to kind of taunt, exploit, control the ones who are below them. That has to change. Parenting dynamics need to change, I feel, and that sensitivity will come in, and that will aid in healing, not only as far as sexual violence is concerned, and any other things, be it a heartbreak of a child, be it a case where a child has not performed academically well, or has been, for example, say, victim of corporal punishment in the school. And every step that healing, parents can contribute to that process.
A major takeaway for me through this call is just how much general empathy can solve.
Yes.
Empathy in the state, empathy in parents, sensitivity around you. So much of these sort of soft core values that we need to, as a society, keep going back to. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for sharing, sir. And I'm sure everyone who's watching, this was pretty enlightening. I'm glad we were able to have this conversation.
I was very happy to share as much as I could. I hope it made sense, and we hope to carry on these conversation forward. That is very important.
Right.
And you can always reach out to me anytime, and for future programs. I also invite your whole team to Assam someday, and I'd be happy to host all of you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Any sort of closing words you would like to say to people watching, to people who are still struggling with their past, or, parents who are trying to navigate the issue? Anything that you would like to close off
So
by?
different for children, yes. For children, if there are children, and children are nowadays all over social media, they definitely need to be aware. They need to find out of about ways, and they're smarter than us. They
Yeah.
can figure out ways of protecting themselves. They should again extend that to their peers, which is very important. Parents being sensitive. Number one, parents should be sensitive. If your child has gone through abuse, you have to be extra supportive. You have to help the child walk through that protection pathway and that pathway towards healing. And reporting is very important, because in non-reporting, there are two things. One, it will never give justice to the child, and secondly, what happens, that offender will go and abuse 100 more children. That needs to be stopped. Like, we need to put the bad guys off the street. So that is very important. uh, uh, for teachers, definitely they should stop using any form of violence, endorsing any form of violence. They should have these regular conversations with children. It should again come into the curriculum. That how children can protect themselves from all forms of violence, and through practice as well. If I say that I am against violence, I should practice non-violence myself. Nowadays, people laugh at non-violence. They call you a pacifist and all kind of names, and that's why violence is so rife in social media. Important. Organizations like Facebook and whoever I meet, I'm having these conversations. It's so commerce driven that they forget to incorporate child protection into it. Even if they have community standards, even if you're reporting, things are not going off their pages. So even social media needs to be a space where children can be safe. And in general, people, should understand that, there's this entire trolling, memeing, name calling, belittling culture should end. I mean, we can use social media for more constructive dialogues. And one of those dialogues definitely is protecting children uh, from every form of violence, and especially sexual violence.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir, for sharing, for all your stories, for all the information. And I hope that everyone who's struggling finds that sense of connection, empathy, and space to share their journey and their story. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arzu. It was wonderful having this conversation.
Thank you so
Bye.
much.
Have a great weekend.